This is part one of the AQA GCSE History Germany 1890 to 1945 topic, where I'm going to cover some of the key things that you should remember about Wilhelm and Weimar Germany. Part one of the course covers the period from around 1900 up until the Wall Street crash of 1929 and then the depression that follows in Germany in the 1930s. The first bit of it looks at Wilhelm himself and how Germany had grown in power at this time. Then it moves on to have a look at the impact that the First World War has on Germany before looking at Weimar Germany, the way that Weimar Germany was structured, so its constitution, and also the crises that they face in the first few years of its existence, and then the period that some people call the Golden Age, where there's more stability that follows. Wilhelm was a grandson of Queen Victoria. That's not that unusual in Europe at this time because Victoria had quite a lot of different children, and like all royal children, they often married into other royal families. He was the Kaiser of Germany from around 1888 onwards, and he followed this policy of Weltpolitik. So this is the idea that you are very assertive, you're very aggressive in your foreign affairs, in the hope that by being very aggressive and getting close to war but just stopping short of it, you could achieve your objectives. He had made it known that he desired Germany to have a place in the sun. He wanted an empire for Germany, which was something that Britain had and France had, and it was seen as one of the hallmarks of being a great power. Since 1871, when Germany was formed, it had grown very quickly in its power. It had industrialized on a rapid scale. In fact, by the time you get to the early 20th century, they were either matching or outproducing Britain in key areas like coal production and steel production. And this growing industrialization creates a lot of wealth in Germany, and of course creates a lot of military power for them as well. Along with that growing industrial power, you also have growing calls for more workers' rights. So there's a growth of the idea of socialism, of workers, of the ordinary people of Germany actually wanting more control over what happens in their lives, and even wanting more say in what happens in Germany and their government. This is a problem for Wilhelm because he is an autocratic ruler. He has complete power. He can act almost as he pleases. And there is a Reichstag, but he can ignore that if he chooses. He can act alone. The growth of socialism is a bit of a threat to his power base. So he always has to try and be a bit wary about the growing industrialization and how this has an impact on growing calls for workers' rights. Because of Wilhelm's desire to have a navy, to have this place in the world, they introduce these laws known as the Navy laws, which essentially put in place in law that they are going to build these battleships, that actually much of German society, much of German industry should be geared towards constructing a modern navy that could rival the British Navy. And the fact that they make these specific laws about it shows how serious this was to Wilhelm, how important he felt it was for Germany's future, even for Germany's survival. That's almost what he sees it as. Now, ultimately, this desire to gain territories and colonies, at least in part, contributes to the outbreak of the First World War, and ultimately during the First World War they are unsuccessful, they lose it, and Wilhelm has to abdicate at the end of the war. Now all of that stuff about the First World War is not within this unit. What is within this unit, the Germany Depth Study, is about the impact that that war has on Germany. So that's where we want to go to and have a look at next. Let's take a look then at what impact the First World War actually has on Germany itself. And you need to divide these down into the social impact, so the impact on people and their lives, the political impact, the impact on the way that Germany was governed, and the economic impact, the impact on the finances of Germany. So let's start with the social. The war exaggerates the gaps in living standards. So there was already a bit of a gap in living standards. Those that were very rich had very good lives. Those who were very poor were very poor, and there's quite a wide gap between them. The war makes that worse. It increases the gap. So the poor become poorer, and the rich do often become richer, particularly as many factory owners make an absolute fortune out of the war, making the stuff that you need for war, whereas the workers struggle. There's a lot of women that go and work in the factories during the First World War, which is a necessity whilst many of the men are away fighting. But for many ordinary Germans, they feel that it is damaging to traditional family values. So there is a push at the end of the war to remove those women from work and put them back into the home, seen as their traditional place. And by the way, that's not unusual in Germany, it's not unusual in Europe. The same kind of thing happens in Britain, with many women being sacked from their jobs and sent back into the homes to go and do their role there as wives and mothers. So this isn't an unusual view at the time. Many of them seen it as damaging to traditional family values. As well as the social impact, there is of course an enormous political impact of the First World War. Wilhelm has abdicated in November 1918, and this leads to a revolution in Berlin where they decide that they're going to try and forge ahead with this idea of democracy. Today, that's an idea we often take for granted, but actually in Europe at that time and in the world at that time, democracy and the idea that everybody gets a say is a fairly new idea, really. It's been around for some time, but the idea that actually each individual person gets a say, that's a fairly new idea. It's very progressive, it's quite forward thinking. But what it means is that you end up with lots of different political parties, different groups who are competing for power. They all want to be able to be in power in Germany. At the same time, there's a lot of ex-soldiers that believe they've been stabbed in the back. There's a lot of former soldiers that can't understand why they've lost the war. After all, when the war ends, these soldiers are not in Germany. They're in France and Belgium. So Germany still had bits of France and Belgium. They end up having to give it back. But for many soldiers, they can't understand how they've lost. And this theory spreads that they've been stabbed in the back, that actually they could have won the war if only their leaders were strong, and their leaders have stabbed them in the back. They've messed them up. This is especially felt when in 1919 the leaders of Weimar Germany sign the Treaty of Versailles. It is the Treaty of Versailles that set out to Germany what punishment Germany was going to face because of the First World War, and it was quite severe in its terms. We'll talk more about that later on. And for many ordinary Germans, they feel that it's too harsh, that their leaders could have resisted it in some way. If only their leaders had a spine, then they could have resisted this. They feel that they've been betrayed. And particularly those who are more nationalist, more right-wing, they take this idea that they were betrayed and they run with it over the next decade or so, especially people like Adolf Hitler. The other thing to think about with the impact of the war is the severe economic impact it has. For a start, all those factories that have been making weapons for war now have to convert back to making the stuff for peacetime, but they don't really have much in the way of raw materials. So you see this big drop in industrial production where it drops by about a third. And so does their national income. So the amount of money they take from taxation and from exporting goods, that drops as well. There's around 600,000 women who are now widows. That's important because they've now got to be paid a pension. They get a widow's pension. You know, their husbands have been away to war and they've died in war. They now need to be supported by the state. That costs money. And there's about 2 million children who no longer have a father. Their father has died in the war. So that's colossal as well. That means that those families have lost their main breadwinner. Although these are listed on the slide as individual, remember these all work together as well, because if you've got all these children that now no longer have their father and they haven't got enough money coming into their household, that's going to have a big social impact as well, isn't it? So think about how these connect together too. Weimar Germany decides that it's going to be this democracy. So it's quite progressive, quite forward thinking. It abolishes the monarchy and becomes a republic. So when we say republic, we mean a country that does not have a monarchy. In a really forward-thinking move, they give the right to vote to everybody over the age of 20. So that's both men and women. That's very forward-thinking for the time. In Britain, men over 21 could vote, but women had to be 30 to vote. So there was still that big discrepancy in Britain. Germany is much more forward-thinking than that. They will vote for people to represent them in the German parliament, which is known as the Reichstag. And they're going to vote through a system that's known as proportional representation. What that means is that each party, that means each political group, gets the same amount of seats as they get votes. So if you had the Social Democrats and they got 30% of the vote, they would get 30% of the seats there. The idea was that it is fair and every vote counts. It's a good idea in principle, in theory, but in practice, what they didn't anticipate and what it leads to is that no one party ever gets more than 50% of the seats. Because to get 50% of the seats, you'd have to get 50% of the people wanting that one party. But you've got lots of different parties that are here. It's not just one or two. And that means that often you get parties which struggle to get even anywhere close to 50% of the vote. You know, they're getting 20% or 30% of the vote. That's about it, which means they then have to do a deal with another party to then have enough people to form a government. And of course, if one of the groups that forms that government falls out with the other group that they're sharing power with, then the whole thing collapses and you have to have another election. Now, initially, this doesn't prove a problem, but later on, as times get tough in Germany, the parties struggle to work together and you find that you're having election after election after election and it creates instability and people look at it and think, well, it's chaotic, and they start to think, well, maybe we need an alternative solution. As well as electing people to represent them in the Reichstag, people would also have separate elections for a president. This was the head of state. The president had real power. They're not just there as a figurehead to represent them, but the president had the power to appoint the chancellor. That was their job. Now, the chancellor is a little bit like the British Prime Minister. That's the same kind of job. The president would kind of oversee things, look at the long term. They would make sure that the chancellor's doing their job properly. But when it comes to the day-to-day running of the government, that would be left to the chancellor. That would be their job. They do all the nitty-gritty, all the detail. The Chancellor was usually the leader of the largest party in the Reichstag. That was the way it was meant to work. So if you had Social Democrats with 30% of the seats and they're the largest single group, their leader would get to be the Chancellor. That's the way it would work. But of course, the Chancellor had to have a majority of people in the Reichstag that would support them. They had to have their backing. So if you ended up with a majority that didn't support them, they might not last very long in the job. Furthermore, they realised that with the instability that's already there in Germany, with the end of the war and the revolution that's already been taking place in Berlin, things are a little unstable. And in unstable times, you can't spend a long time talking with your friends about what to do, talking with your opponents about what to do. You've got to make decisions quite quickly. In an emergency, you need one person to step up and make those decisions on behalf of all of you. You don't have time for democracy. That's really it. So they put in place this insurance policy, this emergency measure known as Article 48. And Article 48 stated that in a time of emergency, the president could suspend democracy and rule directly using emergency powers. It was only ever meant to be temporary, and it was seen as a very sensible safety measure, a very sensible insurance policy if there was a crisis. Nobody at the time realises the problems that this might create in the future. So we've got the constitution of the Weimar Republic in place, and at the time they think this is quite progressive and forward thinking, and they've got that insurance policy of the emergency powers that can be invoked, that can be used if there's a crisis they face. And sure enough, there's quite a lot of crises that they face in the years after the First World War. But the crucial thing to remember with these crises that I'll talk more about in a moment is that Weimar survives them. They do not collapse. The actual system they've created works and they survive this period. And that's really important to remember. So on the one hand, you have these political crises that develop. In 1919, the Weimar government signed the Treaty of Versailles. That is the peace treaty that ended the First World War. Now, there's a lot of economic consequences for that, which I'll talk more about in a moment, but there's big political consequences as well. The Treaty of Versailles greatly restricted the German army, so it went down to about 100,000 men. They weren't allowed to have weapons such as tanks and aircraft, and they were greatly reduced on the amount of battleships they could have. For many people in Germany, this is a humiliating peace treaty. They think it's going to destroy Germany, or at least going to greatly weaken Germany into a position where it could never recover. Meanwhile, within Germany, you have many workers suffering for the reasons I mentioned previously, because of the death of lots of men during the war, leaving lots of widows and lots of children without their fathers, lots of women now forced out of factories back into the home. For a lot of ordinary workers, they are unhappy with what's happening in Germany. They don't like the system that's being created, and they feel it's serving the rich and the wealthy and it's not serving them. Also remember as well that just 2 years before 1919, in 1917, there'd been a revolution in Russia where the communists had taken power there. Now, communism, this idea that everybody's equal, that everything will be shared out equally. So redistribution of wealth, no rich, no poor, everybody gets the same. That idea becomes popular amongst many workers across Europe. Think of it this way: if you're a worker who has nothing or next to nothing, it sounds quite good if you're told, well, actually, we're going to take from the rich and give to the poor. We're going to equal it out. That's a popular idea. And if you feel there's no option for you, you might get on board with that idea. Within Germany, there's a political group called the Spartacists. They are the communists. That's what they are. And in 1919, they seize parts of Berlin in an attempted uprising. Ultimately, this fails. The Chancellor at the time, a man called Ebert, he manages to defeat the uprising, and he defeats it with the use of ex-soldiers. So remember, there's lots of these ex-soldiers that don't really feel they've lost. They feel they've been stabbed in the back, and they're a bit unsure about this new Weimar Germany. They think Germany should be a bit more proud of itself, that it should be stronger, it should be made to be a great country. Many of these ex-soldiers join these groups known as the Freikorps. So the Freikorps are groups of ex-soldiers who come together thinking that Germans should be proud of being German, that actually they need to show strength against their former enemies, the British, the French, the Americans, and so on. They're a powerful force. They're a powerful force. Ebert uses them to defeat the Spartacists. So he asks for their support in literally fighting these Spartacists and defeats them. And he does. He defeats them. The Freikorps, under Ebert's direction, end up defeating this uprising. So uprising 1, defeated. Weimar survives. Fast forward a few months. In 1920, you get this man called Wolfgang Kapp, who is a nationalist, so on the right wing. Now, many of the Freikorps are also nationalist, also right-wing, because they think Germany should be proud of who it is and should rise up once more. They are attracted to Wolfgang Kapp. Wolfgang Kapp tries an uprising, and sometimes in German we use the word Putsch, which means like an uprising or rebellion. So in 1920, he rises up and takes control of parts of Berlin. Crucially, the Freikorps join him. They support him. So these groups of ex-soldiers go and support Wolfgang Kapp. So Friedrich Ebert, the Chancellor, in the first crisis in 1919, he'd used the Freikorps to defeat the uprising. In the second crisis in 1920, he can't use them because they are part of this uprising. So instead, he turns to the workers And what he asks them to do is to go on strike. He asks the ordinary workers, go on strike, and that includes those people that are involved in electricity production and gas production and water supplies, all that. The idea being that you're going to cut off Wolfgang Kapp and his supporters. So you're going to completely isolate them, cut them off so that they can't communicate with anybody else, they can't inspire a further uprising. And it works. So Ebert has defeated the Spartacists in 1919, he then defeats the Kapp Putsch in 1920. That's the last of the really major uprisings that he faces. Until 1923, there's an uprising that takes place, this time not in Berlin, but down in Munich, where a little known right-wing, far right-wing party, known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazis, attempts to take over, but ultimately fails. It's not particularly well organised, and actually news of their attempted rebellion leaks out before they even attempt it, so that once they go on the streets in Munich to try and take over, the army is there ready to take them down. Adolf Hitler, its little-known leader at the time, is arrested and famously uses the trial to become even more famous, and is not actually punished that harshly because the judge quite likes Hitler's ideas and agreed with him. So the Munich Putsch, of the three political uprisings, is the lesser of the threats. The other two, the Spartacists and the Kapp, are more of a threat, but crucially, Weimar survives all of them. Probably the more severe crisis they face is an economic crisis. So the Treaty of Versailles, as well as imposing restrictions on their army and navy and their air force, it also said they had to pay an enormous amount of money in reparations. This was essentially compensation for all the damage that they had caused in the First World War. Germany was blamed for causing the war. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles was known as the War Guilt Clause. So Germany had to accept that it was completely to blame for the war. The reason that they forced the Germans to accept that is because then they can say, well, because you have accepted you're to blame, you have to pay compensation. And they set the figure at £6.6 billion. That is an astonishing sum of money. It's an astonishing sum of money today in the 21st century. Back in 1921, I think it is, when they actually agree that figure, it is a colossal sum of money. And put simply, Germany is always going to struggle, probably fail to make the payments. And in 1923, sure enough, they failed to make their reparations payments. It wasn't 6.6 billion in one go, by the way. The idea was you were going to make payments each month or each quarter. But in 23, they fail. The French, not about to stand for that, so they invade the Ruhr, which is a region just on the border with France, and it's a very heavy industrial region. There's a lot of natural resources there. France's plan is they're going to go there and take natural resources in lieu of payment. They're going to need the German workers to actually get the natural resources out of the ground, though. So the German government at the time orders the workers to go on strike. They just tell the workers, go on strike, don't do what the French tell you. Because that way, the French then have a choice. Either they bring in their own people to try and do it, but they're not really familiar with it, and can they get enough workers? Or they then, threaten them and open fire, which wouldn't be a good look for the French. So in some ways, it's quite a clever move by Germany, ordering them to go on strike. This, by the way, is known as passive resistance. Passive resistance. So you're not actually going to openly fight the French, you're just not going to do what they tell you. Passive resistance. The French do try, by the way, to bring in some workers, but they never can really get enough raw materials out of the ground. And because the government have told the workers to go on strike, the government have to keep paying the workers, but now they have even less money coming in. So the government decides that it will simply print more money. Now, this is a very dangerous thing to do. You can get away with printing a little bit more money, but you can't print more money than you're worth. I mean, that's the golden rule. You can't print more money than you're actually worth, because you can't just make money out of thin air. And that is the mistake that the German government make. They print more money than they are worth. It leads to prices spiraling out of control because people lose confidence in the value of the money. They look at the money and they go, well, I know that the government's printed more of this money, so I don't think that that banknote is really worth what it says on the banknote. And if you don't think the money is worth as much, what are you going to do if you're a business owner? You're going to put your prices up, aren't you? So they do. And that's what happens. And it doesn't just happen on a weekly basis. It ends up happening on a daily basis and sometimes twice a day. Businesses will start putting their prices up and up and up. So you end up paying millions and millions of German marks, that's the currency, just to get a loaf of bread. It is absurd. The currency has collapsed. Eventually, a new chancellor comes on called Gustav Stresemann. Stresemann decides that they've got to take quite drastic action. Crucially, he negotiates to get money loaned to Germany from the United States under what's known as the Dawes Plan. This meant that you could then restart your reparations payments to the Germans with a brand new currency. So the old currency of the German mark is scrapped, and they just replace it with a brand new German currency called the Rentenmark. And this currency is backed up by the Americans. So the Americans, a very strong economy, have guaranteed this currency. That gives it value. He restarts the reparations payments. Sure enough, in about 1924 or so, the French withdraw from the Ruhr and things calm down. And actually, the economy settles down. So you've got the political crises that take place of the Spartacist uprising, the Kapp Putsch and the Munich Putsch, and Weimar survives them all. And you have the economic crisis, which arguably is far more severe to them. It's more of a threat to Weimar in its very early years than the political crises, but it survives that as well. So these two major crises that it faces, it survives both of them, which arguably shows the strength of the Weimar Republic. From 1924 onwards, following Gustav Stresemann becoming Chancellor and the introduction of the new currency, the Rentenmark, there is much more stability that follows. Gustav Stresemann doesn't actually stay on as Chancellor for very long, just a few months, but he stays on as Minister of Foreign Affairs, so their Foreign Secretary. So he's still playing a very key central part in the German government. And what you see is what some people call a golden age. Now, there's a bit of a question mark this, because there is certainly stability within Germany. After the years of unrest, there's much more stability, and you see a lot of culture that flourishes at this time, and you see also Germany being more accepted back into the international community. But some of the fundamental problems are still there. So the fundamental problem of the actual political system, where they have proportional representation, and that doesn't really lead to very strong governments, that's always there in the background. So as to how far it's a golden age is a bit questionable. And it's not a golden age for everybody, certainly. For many Germans, they look at this period and it alarms them. So it is a very progressive time. You find women gaining more rights and more confidence and wearing ever shorter skirts, which does alarm many traditional right-wing people, both men and women, by the way. Those that live out in the countryside, in more rural areas, are a bit alarmed at what's happening in the cities and the towns. They think that it is the denigration of their society, that it's everything that's wrong with it. And you have politicians, far-right politicians like Adolf Hitler, that say, look, this is all that's wrong with our society and it's going to ruin it. This is going to ruin Germany. We need to get away from it, back to traditional values. But there are things that do flourish at this time. Certain styles of architecture, like Bauhaus architecture, quite angular, quite blocky in their formation, quite modern, become really popular at this time. German cinema actually at this time is one of the leading movie industries in the world. You know, it rivals Hollywood at this time. It is one of the leading movie industries in the world, and you get famous actresses like Marlene Dietrich at this time, who become almost a sex symbol at the time as well. Remember, this is all just in the 1920s. This is really quite modern, forward-thinking, progressive. And at the same time that you've got this development of culture in Weimar Germany, Germany is more accepted onto the world stage. So at the end of the First World War, an international organisation called the League of Nations had been formed. This was a bit like today's United Nations, where nations would meet together and discuss their problems to try and sort out any disagreements they had. Germany was forbidden from joining that because it was seen as the causer of the First World War. But by 1926, a few years have passed and people are starting to wonder, maybe it's time that we let Germany in. Maybe it's time that we actually started to get on with them again. So they're allowed to go and join the League of Nations. That's a big moment. Crucially, they're actually welcomed in by the French. I think it is the French that actually make the speech to welcome them into the League of Nations. So their former arch enemy actually welcomes them in and shakes their hand. That's a big moment. It's a very positive moment, and it is another achievement of Gustav Stresemann. You know, he is the Minister of Foreign Affairs that manages to get that negotiated. Furthermore, in 1929, a new economic plan is negotiated to follow up the Dawes Plan. So they negotiated the Dawes Plan, which restarted the reparations payments back in 1923 and introduced the new currency. They now negotiate with the Americans the Young Plan, which is a more wide-ranging agreement, and it reduces the reparations payment. So this therefore means that Germany now has less of an economic burden. It's more settled. So by 1929, things are looking up in Germany. Yes, the governments sometimes don't last very long, but actually life for many people has improved, and they have survived both the political and the economic crises that they faced. However, one thing that they could not have foreseen was that events that were to take place in the United States in 1929 were going to have a devastating impact on the German economy and lead to a period of severe unrest.